Good evening, everybody. It is 10 o'clock on Saturday night Eastern time, although I am in the Central Time Zone where it's only 9 o'clock. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical, and I have with me from his secret lair in the Witness Relocation Program. So, Pat, I am glad that we were finally able to get you back on your show.
I appreciate you holding down the fort for the last 7 to 8 months.
Yeah. So, I've been talking with Pat on a regular basis during all this time, and I know for at least part of it, he was learning what it was like to be a 53-year-old student, which is always fun.
Yeah, that's the best.
And we're going to talk about that tonight because we're going to talk about, I don't know, Pat, if you saw what I titled the show. I called it Starships, Airliners, and General Discussion.
Oh, okay.
Because you've done a lot of stuff. I've done a lot of stuff since the last time I was on, and some of which I can talk about and some of which you can talk about. And in addition to that, Pat and I did the thing that we always do. Like what are we going to talk about? Oh, we could talk about X. And then we proceed to have like a half-hour long conversation on the thing that we're going to talk about, which on the one hand is good because, hey, we verify that we've got plenty to talk about and we can go and do the thing. But on the other hand, it's like we had a big chunk of the conversation that we're now going to try to recreate.
Yeah. Well, repetition's important. That's what I've been doing for the last 3 months. Same thing over and over again.
You know what we were doing? We were rehearsing. We're professionals now.
There you go. That's it. That's what we were doing.
I'm glad that the things that we get paid to do we're much more professional at than the things that we don't get paid to do. At one point, I thought that Alec might join us, but he wasn't sure because there was something he might have gotten called to do. I think it involved selling fireworks at a stand or something like that. And so he wasn't sure. And he didn't respond when I pinged him earlier today. I talked with Chris Carlson at one point when Pat was still not sure if he was going to be able to make it. And I've got ideas. I was going to try to work on them today. That didn't happen. I've got ideas on what I'm going to do in the relatively near future. I want to talk about the interwar naval treaties and how those affect everything. Like, it's real easy to say, we should have been more into aircraft carriers, but until shortly before the war, we were actually limited in how many aircraft carriers we could have, right?
Yeah.
And we ended up building all this force structure that was still around when the war happened, and we built it because that's what the treaties let us build. And so I want to sort of get into some of the distorting and effects, and I can tell a story about maybe some of this being part of the Klingon Federation Treaty and all the other stuff too. And then I want to talk about Littoral Combat Ship and Robert Work and what parts of it were an experiment where we concluded that the right answer is no, but we learned something in the experiment, and what parts of it were just plain wrong to begin with and stuff like that.
Well, one thing that it occurs to me is that the Littoral Combat Ship, and correct me, or like I could be completely way off base here because this is not necessarily a super informed opinion, and nothing we had prior rehearsed. But it strikes me that the Littoral Combat Ship is fine in a world where you're the only superpower, where you're not going to be up against a peer competitor. Like, if the sky and the coast are yours, then yeah, you can have small boat operations and SEALs running back and forth, and it's a nice little mobile base and everything like that. But if you got somebody with real guns, real weapons that don't want you operating on their coast, then you probably can't with that thing, because it's not truly, it's not an Arleigh Burke. I'm not even sure it's a Perry class frigate.
No, it's not. It's not. Yeah. And in theory, it was supposed to have more capability for self-defense. And the idea is that for area defense, it'd still be defended by bigger units. But it was basically trying to recreate the flotilla that Corbett talks about, right?
But even then, to be protected by a
Yeah.
BERK or Tycho,
Yeah.
that Tycho still has to be 10 miles away, which is
Yeah.
still,
It's
you're
sort of
still
based.
on the coast,
Yeah.
which
And
is
you're,
where I believe that's where they tend to park their diesel class submarines, their diesel submarines. So
yeah.
it doesn't make
Yeah.
sense.
It there's some things there. Like if you're gonna provide the heavy hitting power with a Burke or a Tycho, then you're still tethering a Burke or a Tycho, right? You're not replacing it. You're still having to use it.
Yeah.
And so there's all sorts of issues there. So I want to sort of get into some of that because I think it's very interesting, especially since in the real world, the world that you and I live in, Corbett came up with this. He talked about the three parts of the fleet, and he talked about the flotilla, and we've largely replaced the flotilla.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of workaday, mining and scouting and anti-scouting and all that other stuff. We've largely replaced that with aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we didn't. Um, so in the real world, that the mission has changed, but in a science fiction world, like if we did something in Star Trek, I can make the argument for the flotilla in Star Trek. In fact, I think we see the flotilla in Star Trek. Maybe it's called something different. And as one Horshay says, LCS, you mean the Miranda class? And it's like,
Well,
yeah,
so then I think that was an interesting point. I wanted to address that because I think it depends on what era you're talking about. When the Miranda
yeah,
class was relatively new in the 2280s and the Wrath of Khan period. So there's an analysis by a guy who basically comes to the conclusion that the Miranda class, despite the fact that it looks smaller than a Constitution
oh, it is
class,
not.
it is not. There is more interior volume in that thing with that raised section in the back. Um, and so it's got more space, and it clearly has two large hangar bays, and then that's modifiable space on the ship that can be changed and done for mission things. Presumably, if you read ships of the Starfleet, instead of a torpedo pod, you could have a sensor pod or a jamming pod or a whatever on
Yeah.
that thing. So yes, in that sense, you do have that mission capable thing. Now on the LCS, that didn't really work out, right? The idea was, hey, drop a Connex box on the ship. You just plug in a couple wires, bring 10 guys on board the ship, give them a Connex box to sleep in, and everything will be fine, no problem. But all that always seemed far fetched to me. Like it's not going to be so simple that you plug it in, and then you've got 5 extra Connex boxes for different missions for each ship.
The part
So
that I thought was a really heroic assumption on their part is
that's generous.
yeah, they were saying, well, we're gonna have this deployable system that's gonna fit in the Connex box, and it's gonna do X, Y, and Z. And my response on some of that stuff is, I can't build a ship that has that capability built in that does X, Y, and Z,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like they were talking, remember the phrase "in stride mine hunting"?
I do not remember that phrase.
Oh, that's because you weren't like up to your eyeballs in it at the Naval War College at the time.
No,
In
I wouldn't.
stride mine clearing, in stride mine hunting. So the idea was in stride means, the way mine hunting works now, the way you clear mines now is everybody stays the fuck away, except for the mine hunter guys. They get to go in and clear the area, and everybody else stays away from it because, we can't
Because
conduct
mines.
because mines, right? And so this entire idea behind in-stride mine clearing was, well, no, we're just going to sort of do it as we cruise through, right? The idea is that supposedly our capabilities had gotten so much better that we were going to be able to do it in real time, as opposed because the way it normally works is you call timeout. All right, timeout for all you guys. You guys, go get something to eat. Come back in 2 weeks, and maybe we'll have a path cleared for you. And
Mm-hmm.
the idea was, no, they were just going to do it in real time as the battle group goes through. And yeah, right. Yeah,
I
right.
mean, I guess unless you have some really, really good, and maybe they do. I'm not up on all the unmanned underwater vehicle things, but theoretically, if you can have those things going out ahead of you, sniffing all that stuff out, maybe.
And they
I'd
they
be
had
willing to bet we're not there yet, though.
they had a whole bunch of ideas, and if they panned out, it would have worked. And then you couple that with, they were working with other services on some systems and the other services backed out, and it turns out this is harder than we thought, and this other thing doesn't work. And so you end up with, so we haven't even talked about, and we should probably actually table this conversation because I'm going to do it.
All right, this is good.
Yeah, but you end up with, we haven't even talked about the fact that they're running the crews ragged because they have a third as many people as they need, and that every one of them has to be an A-list performer. Every one of them has to be a Starfleet guy in order for them to do it, and it has to be trained in 5 different jobs, and they have to subsist on 2 hours of sleep.
Yeah. Well, and at least during the War on Terror, right, we were stripping the manning from our ships, and so that it could go put on an army uniform and hand out basketballs at the gym in Afghanistan or whatever other job. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a whole variety of jobs. Actually, that reminds me, there was a one of those motivation posters, and it says, Afghanistan in big letters at the bottom. On one side is a picture of some infantry guys trudging through a dust storm, looking all miserable and everything like that. And then in the other picture, it's, 2 people standing in line at the Starbucks at whatever the little exchange is on whatever base you were at in Afghanistan. It says, Afghanistan, your experiences may vary.
Yes.
So,
one of the
people did certainly different things.
So during my time working for the Navy, I frequently got to listen to what Fleet Forces was coming up with. Fleet Forces Command was coming up with.
Yep, I worked there.
Yeah, I know, and I've, maybe it's something in the water. Was it something in the water? As a general rule, it's like, okay, I don't know what's going on with these guys, but there was one idea that they had that I thought they were right on the money about. Now, okay, now's a good time. I don't speak for any employer, past, present, or future.
Me too.
None of this is the official position of anybody. It's certainly not Pat's Pat's employer either, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So standard caveats.
Yes, I do not speak for my employer at any point here.
Yeah, past, present, or future.
Yeah, past, present, or future.
The one thing that I thought that Fleet Forces, actually, the one position they had where I sort of went, hot damn, they're right. Fleet Forces said, look, the Navy needs to stop sending all these people to the sandbox. The Navy's official position should be, all you ground force guys, you go deal with Afghanistan and Iraq. We're going to do the rest of the world. We're going to keep the lid on the rest of the world so that you guys don't have to worry about it, and things will be okay when you get back.
And because I mean, Afghanistan, I don't know. Afghanistan's kind of a big sinkhole, I suppose, but obviously that's obviously a long, complex subject I'm not fully educated on. So
I like Stephen Ross.
Built in the Tim Hortons. There is, never seen one anywhere else. Certainly never very far south. There is one at the base in Norfolk, Virginia, the Norfolk Naval Station. There's a Tim Hortons at the back gate. So, or at least there used to be a few years ago.
So let's not let it never be said that our Canadian brethren did not contribute to the overall success of the mission. There's a Tim Hortons. So,
hey, that's pretty good.
But oh well. So in any event, I'm going to go ahead and throw up the agenda and stuff like that.
Oh, all right.
All right. So here's what the Chris-centric schedule looks like. Pat, I have no idea what Pat's schedule looks like. I suspect.
Neither do I.
Yeah, Pat doesn't know either. So Pat is enjoying the life of leisure as he waits for his new airline to schedule him some flights. Because Pat is doing some new things, and he's going to talk to us about it. But Pat's also in the situation where he leveled up, which means he's now at the bottom of a totem pole instead of being at the top of the totem pole. So my guess is we'll hear from Pat like every 3 months. He'll stop by and wave or something.
I'll do what I can. Yeah.
Until he works his way back up the totem pole and he's not,
Yeah, I'm never going to get very far up that totem pole. So I've only got 11 years left. So,
well, maybe far enough.
Yeah.
Maybe far enough.
It's fine. Don't get me wrong. It's all first world problems. So I'm okay.
Yeah. So in any event, I think the only time in the next couple of months where I don't know what's going on with me that I look at it right now and say I'm not available is the 29th of June. And that I should know the answer to that one on the 22nd of June, because it basically boils down to the week before the 29th, I'm at a conference. And so if I'm not ready by the 22nd of June to do if I don't have my act together for the 29th of June, by the 22nd of June, I won't have the opportunity to get my act together. And so I need to work ahead a little bit. And then the 3rd of August, I don't remember exactly what's going on the 3rd. Oh, the 3rd of August is probably because that's the weekend of AXICON, and I plan on going to AXICON. So fingers crossed. Maybe that if I can make the arrangements with Alec and get some other stuff squared away, we may actually do a show from the Ares Studios bridge, which I wanted to do forever. And Pat, if you can make it, Pat and I have been talking for years about going down and shooting some scripted stuff on the Ares Studio bridge and then like doing a show down there. And I'm hoping that we're able to do it. So
yeah, that would be cool. Hopefully I can do that. That'd be great.
Yeah. So all the standard caveats, I'm pulling some images from some places. They're the property of the originators. We're going to add educational value through commentary, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about Pat's new ride. We're going to compare Pat's new ride to Picard's ride. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about MARcon, because a bunch of people got together at a science fiction convention last weekend, which is why I wasn't here. And basically everybody who was there has either been on the show or has been mentioned on the show. So all the people I hung out with. And I've got the dates for next year's MARcon, and people are willing. I think it's going to turn into an annual thing where I just sort of get an extra room. And we did it again this year, and it worked out well. So Pat, do you recognize that airplane?
Yeah, vaguely. It's all been a blur.
So what airplane is that, Pat?
It's an Airbus 320.
Have you ever been in an Airbus 320, Pat?
Yep, I have flown in one in the flight deck from the pointy end 11 times so far.
You're up to 11 so far. Okay.
Up to 11. Yep.
So Pat told me something that was utterly shocking to me. I said, he was doing all the simulator stuff and he was doing all the book learning and all that other stuff. And I said, like, well, when I assume that at some point they take a bunch of you pilots out and they fly and you get to practice on the actual airplane. And your response was, no, they don't do that.
They don't do that. No, my very first flight, I had passengers on board the airplane. So, but it sounds worse than it is. So
yeah, it almost
back up a little bit. So one of the key things is yes, and I believe most airlines do this, is that your very first flight in a particular airplane, when you're a new hire to the airline, or you have just transferred from a different airplane to whatever new airplane you're on, your first flight in that airplane is going to have passengers on board. And however, I'm not flying with just any other airline pilot. I'm flying with a very experienced, highly trained line check airman, basically an instructor pilot. And that person is there and is good enough at their job that I'm not really that necessary. as the new guy on board, right? So that person is trained and proficient in making sure everything is good, because as with anything, when you're learning something new, you might not be that great at it on day one.
Now,
And when I say by day one, I mean your first day flying the physical airplane. By the time I've gotten in that airplane, I have spent some untold number of hours doing procedural trainers with instructors, six at least six events in procedural trainers, plus another test. I have spent, or any airline pilot will have spent numerous other hours and events in simulators, learning maneuvers with engine failures and emergencies and approaches under different conditions and different weather and winds and all that kind of stuff. And then you've done even more sims where you start at a gate, and it's, essentially your simulator instructor behind you in that simulator is the game master or the dungeon master, and they're giving you little events throughout your entire little journey. And then you have to handle all of those problems and situations appropriately to move on to level 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And then at the end of that, there's a test. So, I had spent more than a month, just like any other airline pilot, studying, going through simulator training and procedural training before you even get into the airplane on day one. So it's not like you're going into the plane cold.
yeah, and of course, the ironic thing, of course, is that you used to be the guy that was sitting behind playing the dungeon master at your previous.
Yes. So, as with anything in life, change is hard, and going from being the expert to the new guy, is not always that much fun. Sometimes it's not that much fun. Or at a minimum, it's a challenge. Let's put it that way.
So before you got to this jet, how many hours did you have?
I've got about 8,000 hours of flight time or something like that. It's really, for somebody my age, it's not that much, but I had this 8-year detour where I went on active duty in the Navy. So I paused my airline career and then went and did worked for the Navy for 8 years. Then I got off active duty, joined an airline, flew around for a couple of years at that airline, and then became an instructor because I already had many thousands of hours of flight time. And I figured it was probably more useful for me to be teaching 20-year-olds how to fly the airplane than me just getting another couple hours a month here and there flying the plane. So anyways, yes, I was one of those. I was essentially a Czech airman, and I would run tests for people in the simulator as well as be an instructor. So it was a lot of fun. Honestly, that was the best job in the entire world, I think. So
yeah,
it was good. It was very good.
You seem to be having a good time.
I did. I had a lot of fun with that.
One of my great regrets was that I never found the time to make it up to Minneapolis and visit your simulator.
Yeah, if you let me know ahead of time, I might be able to make arrangements with somebody to go check things out. So it's still a possibility.
Okay. So now we talked about this airplane, and I'm not the only person that when they heard you were going to go to this, like Brian McHugh said, oh, he's going to learn how to fly a Starship. And so that comes from the fact that this airplane has a reputation of, for good or for ill, some people really hate it and other people really love it. For good or for ill, it has the reputation that you as the pilot are but one of the votes as to what the airplane does, that Correct. The computer has a pretty substantial vote.
Yeah.
And that you were telling me about some of the automated procedures that, things that it does where you're basically using the controls to my words, not Pat's, using the controls to tell the computer what you want the computer to do.
Yeah. You to a certain degree. Now, just like as with any conventional airplane, I can turn off the auto. So this plane has auto throttles or auto thrust. where the plane sort of senses some of the inputs you've given it and instructions you've given it, and it gives you the amount of thrust it thinks you need. And it's a really nice thing. Boeing, Airbus both have that feature. So it's kind of a nice thing. I have not had that particular feature on any plane I've flown before. So that's one of the things I'm learning, is how to incorporate that into my thought process. But in an Airbus, and to a large degree, any airliner, you're kind of a manager. You can certainly turn off the auto thrust, turn off the autopilot, hand fly it with the stick and do all the stick and rudder stuff. You can do that in the Airbus, just like you can do that in just about any other airplane. So that's always an option for you. So a lot of what you're doing is you are trying to make sure that you are using the level of automation that's appropriate for what you're doing and for what the situation is. Every now and then, an autopilot or something like that, or a navigation signal might come in, and the plane might just start doing something you didn't anticipate that it was going to do. Maybe it grabbed onto the wrong signal, or maybe the pilot put in some incorrect input. Either way, very frequently, one of the tenets often is, hey, if the automation's not doing what you want it to do, turn it off, get the wings level, get everything straight again, and then figure out what's going on. One of if on day one as a private pilot, your instructor will tell you 3 words: aviate, navigate, communicate. Doesn't matter what airplane you're in, those still apply, from a Cessna 172 all the way up to a 747 or an Airbus 380 or 350 or whatever. Aviate, navigate, communicate. One person's always got to be flying the airplane. One person has to be managing the flight path of that aircraft, whether it's using automation or flying by hand. Navigate. Once you got the wings level and the plane is at a safe speed and flying safely, then you want to point it in a direction that's appropriate to where you want to go, because usually you're not in an airplane just to burn holes in the sky. And then the next one is communicate. That communication is sort of frequently they mean external communication, talking to air traffic control and all that kind of stuff. So those are your sort of 3 priorities. So if ATC tells me to do something, I want to make sure I get the airplane going in the direction. And there's 2 of us on board. So typically one person handles the aviating and navigating, the other person handles the communicating. The navigating part can be assisted by both people. So, but we always have a pilot flying and a pilot monitoring. And sometimes those labels are a little bit different. And on one leg, I might be the pilot flying and the captain will be the pilot monitoring. And then typically, very often we switch, and then the captain will be the pilot flying and I'll be the pilot monitoring. The pilot flying, make sure the plane is flying safe, not going to bump into anything, all that kind of stuff. Pilot monitoring is there to keep an eye on things, back up the pilot flying, and talk on the radios and stuff like that. And then if you look, I don't know, is there a pointer on here?
No.
Okay. But in that center console there is the FMS and the Airbus, they call it an FMGC. Everybody else calls it an FMS, flight management system. And that's essentially the navigation computer that you program. And when you turn on all the autopilot and on all the automation, it'll fly the programmed route that you gave it. So
we were talking about the stick controller, because it's got side stick controllers rather than a yoke. And we were talking about, you were telling me about what it does, what you would do in a climb, and how the airplane adjusts and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, well, I guess to appreciate how the Airbus flies, you almost have to understand a basic Cessna 152 for the most part. So I'll try to keep it as I'll try to keep it as quick and basic as I can. But when you start flying in a Cessna 172, you don't have any automation or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure some of them out there do, but you have a throttle and you got your little steering wheel, your yoke, and you got your rudder pedals. Okay. If I want to go up, I pull back on the yoke and the nose goes up. And if I want to turn, I turn the wheel left or right and the plane will go into a bank. If I want to go faster, I add thrust. If I want to slow down, I pull the throttle back and slow the plane down. But the point is, as the pilot, I'm doing all of those things. I'm handling the pitch, roll, yaw, and thrust of the airplane and managing that. And of course, as with any airplane, you have to keep it at an appropriate airspeed for your conditions so that the plane doesn't do what's called a stall, which is basically you don't have enough air going over the wings and the wings cease to produce lift. And when they do that, you're a piece of metal that just happens to be in the air at that point.
You fall out of the
sky. You fall out of the sky at least a little bit until you build up some speed again, and then the plane becomes an airplane again. So now, as I progressed through airliners, my very first airliner was a twin-engine turboprop, and it had an autopilot. So in that airplane, when we were out flying, and as you navigate from place to place, you have radio navigation aids. You have radio navigation aids that you would tune in, and they essentially have highways in the sky where you've got a nav aid here and a nav aid over here, and there's a little line, and that might be, there'll be a number assigned to that little airway, and you have to stay if you're flying between those 2 points and your flight plan says you're going to go from here to there, and you have to stay 5 miles or 4 miles either side of that center line. And so as we were flying around, it had an autopilot, but it did not have a flight management system. So I couldn't program that autopilot to do anything. What the autopilot did is kept the wings level, and I had a little heading knob, and if I wanted to turn left to 090, I would turn that little heading knob to 090, and then the plane would do a nice gentle bank to that direction. By the same token, if I wanted to climb, I would have a little altitude setting that I would set. I would dial in the altitude I want, and then I would press some version of a climb button, and the plane would pitch up and start climbing to that altitude. So that's a really basic autopilot where instead of me doing the hands-on controls, I'm dialing in what I want it to do with those things. But the plane won't turn on its own if I'm going on my flight path and there's a left turn. I have to recognize it, be paying attention to the fact that, oh yeah, a left turn's coming up in 2 miles, and I would have to start turning that knob in time to lead the turn so that I don't overshoot the airway. Otherwise, ATC is going to give me a radio call and say, hey, I've got a number for you to call, and I'll get a violation or something like that. So you had to pay attention. Even with an autopilot, you got to pay attention. You can't just take a nap and get out a crossword puzzle.
Tesla operators, take note.
Well, yeah, same thing, right? Cars are getting more automated now, right? So we used to have cruise control. Set the cruise control, and yes, you had to control left or right, but the car actually controlled your speed for you, which is good. Now we've got the lane, car keeps you in the lane at least, and you have adaptive cruise control where it'll slow down. So all that automation is getting better, and you have to decide the level of automation you're comfortable with. So, so then the next more advanced airplane I flew, it had an FMS where I could program in all those navigation aids on the way from my departure point to my destination. And at some point, and I'd have a little moving map on my screen with all the little lines and all the little navigation points that I'm headed to, and a little airplane icon on the bottom of the screen there. And once I pressed the button, actually it's called the nav button, once I got on that and intercepted that flight path, I'd press the nav button and the plane would make all the left turns and right turns I needed it to stay on that path. Now, however, I still had to adjust the thrust. If I was going to climb, I dialed in the climb and hit the climb button. And there's a couple options for how you can climb the airplane. You can have it pitch a certain number of degrees up, or I could dial in hey, I want to climb 1,500 feet per minute, and I could make it climb that way. Or I could say climb at 250 knots, and it would give me the best climb rate it could while maintaining 250 knots.
Okay.
So how you choose to use those different systems varies with airplane and procedures and stuff like that. So, but anyways, the point is had a variety of options. However, if I was going to climb, I still had to add thrust to the airplane. Or if I was in a descent, in order to keep the plane from speeding up too much, I'd have to pull the thrust back. So I still had to manually manage the thrust levers in that airplane. But it would fly all the navigation points however I wanted it to, or in whatever way I programmed it. And then for some reason, if the plan changed or ATC wanted me to do something else, I could always go back to that earlier autopilot mode I described, where I'm manually dialing in speeds and altitudes and headings and stuff like that. So then when you get to, say, a larger Boeing airplane or an Airbus, they have something called auto thrust. I don't claim to know. I've not flown a Boeing airplane, so I don't claim to know all the peculiarities of that airplane. I do know that sometimes Airbus people and Boeing people are like, my plane's better, whatever, that kind of stuff. So different people have different opinions on that sort of thing. And then from there, it probably depends on the specific airframe you're flying. But when you get to something like an airliner, like the Airbus or some of the larger Boeing airplanes, they also have something called auto thrust. And basically what that is you put the thrust levers in a certain little detent or a little spot or a setting, and then the airplane manages the thrust for you based off of your programmed flight path or what you've manually told the airplane to do. So
okay.
I hope that makes some sense. I'm trying to keep it as basic as I can.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you told me about how when you go to manipulate the side stick controller, that you just sort of use it to pull the nose to where you want it to go, and then you release it, and it just sort of says, "Okay, he said he wants 2 degrees up, so I'm just going to stay at 2 degrees up."
Yeah, exactly. So what it does,
the thrust accordingly to keep your speed up.
Yeah.
Auto thrust.
And of course, if you make a demand of the airplane that it's simply not capable of, that's where you potentially get into trouble. Like if the plane's automation is saving your life, that's generally considered bad form as a pilot. So we try to make sure that, because if the plane is saving you, that's kind of like the last line of defense, right? We try never to get there.
So you had told me previously that the idea is to use your good decision-making skills so that you don't have to use your good aviation skills. Correct. This seems to be like even one rung lower.
Yeah. You always want to use your superior judgment to avoid having to use your superior piloting skills. So,
which is very Sun Tzuian for what it's worth. It really is. I mean, there's this argument that the epitome of being a masterful commander is that you're so good that you so outmaneuver the other guy that he never realizes he was outmaneuvered, and as a result, nobody understands how good you actually are. Because they're not smart enough to see it, that they've been totally and completely manipulated from the beginning.
Yeah, if you can beat somebody without them knowing how you beat them, then you have prevented them learning from your victory and then using it against you later.
Or in this case, even knowing that they were beaten.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so,
yeah.
Okay. So first of all, let me say that I can easily think of this in science fiction terms. To start off with, there's I don't know if you've read the Tour of the Merrimack series by R.M. Mellick. Nice series, nice series. It has this interesting thing where something happens 2/3 of the way through the first novel that does a total reset on everything, and it's a very, very nice little thing. But the thing that the reason why I bring it up here is that the Starship helm works a lot like this, and they'll give the ship an order to do something, and occasionally the computer will say, no, too dangerous, I'm gonna do it. Like they'll try to jump out of a situation, and the computer will, and the technical term they give back is balk, right? Computer balks at it. So it's like, nope, computer says no. So we'll try again later, but right now the computer says no. And at some level you sort of go like, what the hell, right? We're in this dangerous situation. Maybe the computer should let me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this might be actually a situation where the human decision makers are doing sort of a gross calculation of odds, whereas the computer is actually saying like, no, really, I've measured all the fold space gradients in this area, and we're not jumping. We're just not going to do it, right? You're using rules of thumb. I'm doing all the damn math. We're not going to.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that occurred to me. The second thing is it reminds me a lot of the write-up of some of the things you see in the Next Gen Tech Manual. And I reread that section on helm operations where you've got flight, you've got helm. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. We'll talk about that, but it really sort of reminds me of that. I've got this theory that the Enterprise doesn't have a crew in a traditional naval sense. The Enterprise has an officer corps. It doesn't have a crew. The crew is the computer. So all of the things that we would normally have sailors do in the U.S. Navy are done by the computer, and that includes mundane things like actually physically manipulate the controls of the ship. Right?
Well, actually, if you watch Lower Decks, there's all sorts of yucky, mundane things that the characters on that show get to do around the ship.
That's true. I have not watched Lower Decks.
It's worth watching. I gotta
watch it. I gotta watch it for no other reason than they canonize the Spock helmet. So, which is just utterly fantastic that they canonize the Spock helmet.
The Spock helmet. What's the Spock helmet?
Oh, you don't remember the Spock helmet? Okay, the Spock helmet. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Is okay, let's see if I can. Actually, probably the best way to do it is to try to just share this. Okay, let me turn that off, do this, share screen. Is it must be showing. Yeah.
Is that the Spock helmet?
That's the Spock helmet. And so this just came up. And I love the fact there's a cosplayer who actually made an adult size Spock helmet.
That's funny.
And he wears it to cons, which is just fantastic. So they canonized the Spock helmet like on episode 3 or 4, and all the fans went wild. All the people that knew about it.
I mean, it really, honestly, I like, my general opinion is I really enjoy Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks. Of all the stuff since Star Trek Enterprise, those two are my favorite. So
yeah, I've seen a bunch of. I saw a bunch of the first season of Strange New Worlds, and there was a lot of goodness there. There was a lot of goodness.
Yeah, there really was. That first season I thought was really, really strong. So,
all right. So next question that somebody asked, which is, so every time I look at that cockpit, my initial thought is I'm really right-handed, and the entire idea of controlling an airplane with my left hand gives me cold shivers.
Aha. No, if you're the first officer, you sit in the right seat. If you're the captain, you sit in the left seat. And if you're the captain, you better figure out how to fly with your left hand. And if you're the first officer, you better figure out how to fly with your right hand. And I've gone back and forth and done both. I am not ambidextrous, but I can fly the airplane just as well with either hand. So, because the other thing is I mean, I am right-handed, but now I am used to having a yoke where you have two hands on the on the wheel kind of a thing. Now this is purely a side stick, but it works a little bit differently. Chris alluded to it, and I didn't get to follow up on it. So when you're in an airplane, I'll explain the whole trim thing that I talked to you about. Think
Okay.
that's useful for everybody.
Yep.
So this is one of the basic ways an airplane works. So if you are in, say, your Cessna 172, and you're flying along at 100 miles per hour, 100 knots, okay, and we have, so we talked about the rudder pedals and the throttles and the yoke and all that kind of stuff, and you use that to fly the airplane. But really what you're doing is the other flight control you have also is the trim wheel. And what that is it's a little wheel, and you can actually see it on in this picture of the Airbus. You can actually see it. It's a wheel there on either side of the thrust levers in the center console.
Okay.
So you kind of see a black and white thing. That's a wheel, actually. And we actually will take that and move it and adjust it to set the stabilizer trim how we want it. But anyway, so in a Cessna 172, so if I'm flying along, the idea is to work as the idea is to not work hard as a pilot. Okay. At some point, you're in straight and level flight. You want to fly this heading and this altitude. You want to stay, if you're supposed to be at 3,000 feet, you want to stay at exactly 3,000 feet, maybe plus or minus 5 feet or something like that. But you want to stay there. Now, if you have to stare at the horizon or stare at your instrument and kind of be constantly adjusting, you're going to be doing this for however long your flight is. It's exhausting. But what we do have is a trim wheel, where what you do is you're flying along, and let's say I'm holding a little bit of back pressure to hold the nose up so that I can fly level. Well, I don't want to sit there and have to hold that back pressure the entire time. My arm's going to get tired. I didn't get into flying to work hard. So with the little trim wheel, I can add a little stabilizer trim. And what I do is I add a little trim, and then I sort of let go of the yoke a little bit or relieve some of the pressure and see if the nose stays where I want it. And eventually, once I've learned how to set the trim, I can let go of the airplane and it will fly. It's barring turbulence or, some giant wind gust or something like that. It will stay pretty much at its altitude and its airspeed. So if I'm at 100 knots on this heading at this altitude, everything's good. And then I don't have to work very hard, right? I mean, if you're doing the Luke Skywalker thing, flying down the Death Star, sweating, looking at it, you're working way too hard. Now, granted,
did you ever notice how Luke Skywalker spent the entire time doing this?
Yeah,
but
he did not have a properly trimmed X-wing. He was going up and down.
But when all the pilots did that, but when they showed the external view, they were on rails.
Yeah. So, well, now this is kind of as a trained eye. If you sit down and watch, if you were to sit at the end of a runway and watch airplanes come in, that airplane's going to seem like it's on rails to you as it comes in and lands.
Yeah.
However, when you're actually flying it and it's a little bit windy and there's some, some rising air and stuff like that, to the outside, it might look like you're on rails. On the inside, you're constantly adjusting thrust and speed and pitch a little bit to compensate for all the rising air or the little wind gusts or even that little 7 knot wind crosswind that you have. You're constantly making adjustments, and and so you're still working pretty hard because you want to make a really nice landing if you can. But my point is that once you have kind of a trained eye and you watch airplanes land, you'll see these little tiny movements and adjustments that the airplane is making. And those adjustments seem insignificant when you're sitting there watching an airplane. But when you're in that airplane, those are bumps, and you might be bouncing around if it's a gusty day and stuff like that. So yeah, yes, and obviously there is no turbulence around the Death Star, or you don't have any, you don't have any heat rising or anything like that adjusting it. But
so your airplane's a fly-by-wire airplane, isn't it?
yes, it is.
Okay,
yep. So anyway, so back to the trim thing. So I've got the plane all trimmed out, and I can let go of the controls, and the idea is not to work very hard. Now, let's say that I were to shove the nose down, and for a little bit, I hold the nose down, and I have to push really hard because the plane is trimmed to stay at 100 knots and at that altitude. But if I push the yoke forward and push the nose down, the airspeed is going to increase. And what's going to happen is because I have the plane trimmed out for 100 knots, even though I've descended and we're doing 120 now, if I let go of the pressure on that yoke, the plane will immediately pitch back up. And it's going to try to find, and it'll do this for a while, but it's going to try to find 100 knots again, and it's going to try to level off at 100 knots. That assumes a stable airplane, which is kind of ideal. A fighter, you don't necessarily want it to be super stable because you want it to be able to do all sorts of things. But generally speaking, the plane will try to return to try to find 100 knots again and level off at whatever altitude it needs to find 100 knots. So when you trim an airplane, you're essentially trimming the airplane for that particular speed. So this airplane, what the Airbus does is if I'm flying along and I pitch up to 5 degrees nose up to do a little climb, all I have to do is bring it up to 5 degrees nose up, and then I can let go of this stick. And in theory, the airplane will then trim itself to keep it 5 degrees nose up. And assuming I haven't exceeded the plane's capabilities or anything like that for thrust, the auto thrust will maintain the exact same speed that I had in that 5 degrees nose up climb, obviously up until I reach, the climb limit of the airplane and stuff like that. But it will hold the nose at 5 degrees and continue to climb at the speed that I had it set for. So if I need to turn the airplane, I can take my stick, turn it a little bit, roll the plane to say a 20-degree bank to make a left turn. And then I can let go of it, and the airplane will maintain that 20-degree angle of bank and make a smooth left turn. It'll, of course, if I'm flying manually, it'll keep doing that. So at some point, I'll have to take that out so that I roll out on the heading that I want. But yeah, the plane auto trims itself. So which is nice. Very nice.
Yeah. Fly by wire is nice. All these things are nice because all this is really enabled by fly by wire. And I had the occasion. I one of the things I did while I was gone, while I wasn't here, is I participated in an event where at one point I said, we were doing some stuff that was experimental, and I said we're in the let's see how many airplanes we can crash phase of the F-16 development program. Because the original fly-by-wire airplane, they crashed so many F-16s that at one point they nicknamed it the lawn dart.
Yeah, I remember it being called the lawn dart.
Yeah, they crashed. I want to say it was something like 24 airplanes, or it was at least a dozen. They were just falling out of the sky. Yeah. And so
And the F-16 is a very unstable airframe. Like you
Oh
can't
yeah,
fly it without the computer, basically.
it's dynamically unstable, and
Dynamically
it's
unstable.
the way I said that program had basically four stages. The first one was, let's see how many airplanes we can crash. The second one was, okay, we got this thing to work. That's great. The third part was, hey, this airplane can do a whole bunch of stuff we didn't realize it can do. And the fourth one was greatest of all time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, we were in the let's see how many airplanes we can crash phase, and we managed to get through without crashing very many airplanes. That was great.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Yeah.
actually, our little experiment worked. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide because we've been talking about the Airbus
Yeah.
320 versus the Boeing, and we haven't really. I figured it probably was good to have a little bit of of sort of a visual guide. And there's two different ways you can look at it. You can look at the physical features of the airplane, and you can also sort of differentiate them based upon a notional flight path. And so on the left, we've got the physical features of the airplane, and on the right, we've got sort of a notional flight path between the Boeings and the Airbus. Now, everybody, please note that disclaimer down in the lower left-hand corner. I'm kind of critical of Boeing in all seriousness, because they've made their bean counters who run that place now. Boeing was famously run by engineers for decades. And within the last 20 years or so, the bean counters took over, and we're seeing the chickens come home to roost. And the bean counters are making decisions that got some people killed. Now, when I first showed this to Pat, his reaction was that the Boeing picture was inaccurate. The last two airplanes that crashed weren't actually on fire when they crashed, and so I took a little poetic license in having the airplane be on fire. But the part on the left really is I think a nice little way of being able to tell them apart, because family wise, they do look different. They each have their own design aesthetic. And so this pretty much sums it up. Although I'll note that the A380, that weird nose on the A380, well, first of all, it can't be anything else. I'm not sure it follows the same. It doesn't quite look the same. It looks more like the Boeing nose, and because of the weird slope on it. But it's that's a really interesting airplane. There's also some things about how the wings, which whether the wings are dihedrals or anhedrals, they have different philosophies on that. But so Wright makes the comment that he has to fly in a Boeing product. He'd rather have it be a B-17 or a B-29. So I'd love to fly on one of those also. We can talk about that when we talk about the science fiction convention, because we did do a side trip to the museum.
Cool.
Okay, I saw this. I thought this was also funny too. First of all, the idea that Pat gets paid to stare out the window all day, and second, the idea that so did Geordie and Wesley.
Yeah, I always kind of like that little meme.
So
third grade, quit staring out the window. When you grow up, no one's going to pay you to sit there and look out a window. Yeah. So.
Now, this actually goes to, and I reread it, and it says clear as day in the Next Gen Tech Manual that usually the main view screen is set on to a photoreceptor that's pointed ahead, so they can stare out the window. And I've always thought that that's the dumbest thing. I've got this giant screen there. Why on earth would I just be looking out into the darkness? There's nothing there most of the time.
Yeah, I've always believed, there would be all sorts of information displayed on that thing, basically.
Yeah, I could see a navigation overlay of some sort.
Yeah.
And with status
display, sensor feed. Actually, at the beginning of Wrath of Khan, that to me was closer to how that screen should be used in most cases, right? You see the plot to the course that they're going to do, and it doesn't totally make sense. The neutral zone's just this sphere, but we can quibble about some of that stuff. But they plotted everything out and all that, and you got to see where they were going, and or it displayed information about the Kobayashi Maru and
Yep.
Gave the stats and everything like that for everybody to see. I thought that was all pretty cool. So
now the F-35 has this giant screen at the front of the cockpit that is user definable, so it looks like it's multiple screens, but it's actually a giant screen.
mm-hmm.
And you can put stuff to, you can gang it up and reconfigure it.
Uh-huh.
And I want to say it was the deputy program manager when I was at the Naval War College. The deputy program manager came and gave us a talk, and that was the first point at which I stopped thinking about the F-35 as a poor man's F-22, because the brains of that aircraft
are significant,
way beyond the F-22.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was listening to his name's Ryan Graves. He was an F-18 pilot. And he was talking about the F-35 and stuff like that a little bit during the interview. And so it was pretty interesting, and things I've read about the F-35.
Yeah.
By all accounts, it's definitely a heavyweight. As actually one of the guys in my new hire class, he had flown F-16s, but he currently flies the F-35 in the Air Guard or Air Force Reserve. And he says, if I'm just going out to go fly, I'd rather fly the F-16. If I'm going to war, I want the F-35.
Yeah.
So I know
that's significant because Viper drivers are obsessive about their airframe.
Sure. Yeah. And you know why it got called the Viper, right?
Yep, because they wanted to call it. A lot of people wanted to call it the Viper because it came out about the same time as Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
And so the pilots are still informally known as Viper drivers, and they end up calling it the Fighting Falcon. Not just the Falcon, the Fighting Falcon, because there's a French business jet called the Falcon.
Yeah.
It's approximately in the same class as the Learjet. And so the Air Force decided that somebody might confuse them, so we need to call it the Fighting Falcon, which is the dumbest decision.
Well, yeah, and it's a throwback to 1940s or something like that. I mean, it feels like what you like. It feels like what you would name a plane in 1940. They basically kept the term Viper because they liked it better. So
now you know what the original call sign of USS Carl Vinson was.
Battlestar, I think, wasn't it?
Battlestar.
Yeah.
And I've never been able to figure out when that call sign went away. It's now Golden Eagle.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, it was Golden Eagle when I first encountered her in like 2002. Mm-hmm. And so sometime between 1980 and 2002, they went away from Battlestar and turned it into Golden Eagle.
Okay.
Yeah. Battlestar would be a lot better. So in any event, I was talking about the F-35. You can actually put all the displays together and treat it as one big display. And somebody said, "Why would you do that?" And I said, "In-flight movie."
Yeah, of course.
Why not? Of
course.
Okay, so next thing is, I wanted to talk a little bit about Picard's ride here, because all the bit with how the computer, how you as the information manager work the computer to fly the airplane, right? You've got there's a lot more than just the rudder and stick stuff. So that's very reminiscent of some of the things that we see. And so this is how they define it in Next Gen. In the Next Gen technical manual, that there's the flight control officer, Khan, who flies the ship. And then there's the ops manager who does everything else about what's going on in the ship. Manages resources, does power allocation, prioritizes sensors, does all this stuff. So flight is aviating and navigating, and ops is doing everything else. And then this includes they give an example of the away team. A lot of it's automated, but like when you're going to send an away team, ops is responsible for making sure that the away team members get notified, that the engineering gets notified that they're going to use the transporter, that a transporter chief is assigned to actually do the transport, that the team can draw weapons from the armory, and whatever other supplies they need. and that their supervisors tell them that they have to, backfill the position so they can go and so they maintain all that stuff. Theoretically, Data does all that. In practice, Data taps a few commands in, and the software handles all that. And he just he just checks the sent items folder to make sure that the emails got sent out to
Well,
everybody.
and just like in a lot of cases, you're making sure that the automation is doing what the automation is supposed to be doing, and so, or assigning or tasking automation resources to do whatever it is you need to get done. So
I was just looking at my phone because Wright has a CVN 70 patch that I'm going to have to find out exactly where he got it and when. I'll try to put it up next time, but it's a Battlestar patch for CVN 70.
cool.
So that's fantastic. So I see Peter Gold's here, Stephen Ryder's here, and I just realized that on the next slide that I think I forgot to put his name on because I was rushing to do it, and then I think I screwed up. So my apologies. If indeed I screwed up, Stephen, I apologize. So in any event, the Virginia class submarine seems to have a fairly similar idea about this, in that usually you've got relatively low ranking people doing the stick and rudder parts on a ship. They're not totally completely untrained. I don't want to make it sound like that, but they've got somebody supervising them, and they they tell them the exact details of what they want the turn to be. They don't have to do any thinking. So basically they don't, as a general rule on a surface ship, the people that are touching the controls to steer the ship aren't actually making the steering decisions. I think the Virginia class actually puts the steering decision into the person who's touching the controls, and as a result, they're using a lot more senior people than the older submarines do. It's very interesting how it works out. And they're also responsible for things like maintaining the trim of the boat. And they're wearing intercom headsets. And so they're in a situation where you've got a couple of chiefs that are giving orders over the radio, and the officers, like the officer of the deck, is only hearing one side of the conversation, which is a very interesting cultural change.
Okay.
So I've never seen it in operation. I've just read about it. Okay. So MARcon, and I did indeed forget to put Stephen there. My apologies, Stephen. I don't understand how I did that, because I went through and were doing people by whose roommate they had. So I really sort of screwed up on that. Stephen Ryder was there also. So this was a convention this is the reason why I wasn't available last week. I was at MARcon in Columbus. We had a bunch of people show up. Tom Pope and I did a bunch of presentations, and then we also ended up in a situation where Andy was unable to see Tom's building a starship in the Omniverse talk, so Tom redid the talk in the hotel room, and Andy did his power systems talk, so his Star Trek power systems talk, because there were people that hadn't seen it. And so I need to get Andy on the show, and we're trying to make that happen. That'll happen. That'll happen. Stephen points out that he's a ninja. So yeah, that's why I forgot it, because he's a ninja, and yeah, I didn't see him. Andy, the problem is Andy has small children, and the way their house is set up is that there wasn't any place that he could be in the house and he could be talking on a podcast at night that it wouldn't wake small children, and then we'd have small children being participants in the podcast. And that would be bad if they were doing that instead of sleeping. So, but they've finished out their basement, and so in theory, the podcasting and YouTubing studio is going to go down there. They just haven't moved all the gear down there yet. So, So they've got this finished basement that they haven't actually, set up Andy's office in. So they're going to do that at some point.
Cool.
But the reason why I bring this out is that this is the sort of stuff that we did. So that aircraft carriers and space talk, everybody on the show will recognize it because it's my old 1-hour aircraft carriers and space talk that I did early on in the show. And then in addition to that, all the stuff I did on torpedo boats in space and all the vector movement stuff about how it really looks like if you change your frame of reference, that's all the rest of that talk. And so I sort of put it all together in one great big long talk. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to continue to do this show, because it puts me in a situation where I'm creating new content that I can then go and, you guys get me thinking about stuff. And then I can polish it up and turn it into something that I can reuse. And so at some point I should come back and just redo the more polished version of it one of these days. MARcon the next one's going to be next year at the end of June. End of May, beginning of June. And so if you come to MARcon, you can come and hang out in the room with us. I don't see any reason why not, right? So, but, and you'll see everybody on that list. So Stephen actually hasn't been on the show, and I haven't talked about him a lot. So maybe that's why I forgot him. Everybody else has either been on, with the exception of my brother Sean, has either been on the show previously in one way, shape, or form, or we've talked about them coming on the show. Oh, we did a side trip to the museum. So we all met on Thursday at the hotel, and then on Friday we drove back to Dayton and did the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, which is a fantastic museum. And TJ is a local, which means this is a museum that he goes to, 3, 4, 5 times a year. And he's been doing that for his entire life. And so he knows the museum really, really very well. And so it's nice having a native guide. I can kind of function as a native guide in that museum, but TJ's got it down. He knows where everything is, et cetera, et cetera. So, Wright asked if TJ's here tonight. TJ posted earlier, so he was here. I don't know if he still is. Yeah, Stephen says better than the docent. There was a couple of instances where well-meaning docents came up and tried to tell us stuff, and they were well-meaning. They, in all cases, they figured out that there was probably somebody else that would be better served by them going and helping them. We didn't need their help. we knew between all of us, we knew more about some of the stuff than the docents did, than the staff did. So let's see. I don't think I have anything else at this point. Do you have anything else, Pat?
No, I think that kind of covers it.
So I mentioned earlier, I'm going to try to do AXICON. It's in Atlanta, at the end of July, beginning of August, and so it's attached to the Starfleet International meeting. So I have to talk to the Starfleet International people and say, hey, I gave you money and you're supposed to give me a membership number so I can sign up for stuff, and you haven't done that yet. So why haven't you done that yet? But worst case scenario, I have a hotel room, so I'll just show up.
Yep. Well, there you go. You can be there.
And so hopefully you can make it too, if your schedule allows.
Mm-hmm.
But, I'll keep my fingers crossed.
So what is it's August 3rd, right? Or that weekend?
Yeah. In fact, let me pull up a calendar so that I get the dates exactly right. So if I remember correctly, the Starfleet International meeting is the Saturday and Sunday. And then AXICON is Friday and Saturday. So Axicon is the second and third, and the Starfleet International meeting, if you care, is the third and the fourth. And so that first day of Axicon is going to be like at Ares Studio.
Okay.
I believe is the plan.
All right. Well, if you're staying down near that if you're staying down near the airport, you're on the wrong side of town, because I believe the studio, I mean, actually, I don't know where the studio is. My impression was everything was on the north side of town.
Yeah, I think he's on the northeast side of town, so it's going to be a trek.
It is, and
but
I know you haven't been in a dogfight recently, but yeah, get ready, because driving in Atlanta, man, that is some serious dogfight type stuff.
I have driven through Atlanta during rush hour.
Okay.
I know what I'm in for.
All right.
And the other thing is, I spent 25 years in DC. So
yeah. Okay.
Which is still worse than Atlanta, but it's not for lack of trying on Atlanta's part. But it's still worse.
Well, isn't it that in DC the traffic is stationary? In Atlanta, it's moving at 90 miles per hour with the option to become stationary at any moment.
Yeah. There is some of that. So,
all right, sounds good. Hey, I'm glad to be back. Glad to be able to join you on this one. I really appreciate it, and thanks for listening to me ramble on about the last couple months of my life. So,
yeah, and I mean, I really think I'm looking forward to learning more about the Airbus, because I really think that there's clearly some things that don't apply, right? Like you don't have to worry about crosswinds, you don't have to worry about this, you don't have to worry about climbing, right? Wing Commander notwithstanding, the Wing Commander movie notwithstanding, but a lot of the other stuff, just in terms of how to think about the interaction between you and the control system, I find that a very fascinating topic.
You have to change your mindset from being a pilot to some degree to being a manager.
Yeah.
Managing the various resources and airspeed and manage the energy on the airplane, all that kind of stuff. So,
and I think the Airbus is a better model for Star Trek than like an Arleigh Burke destroyer is. I think.
Yeah. At least the control portions of it. I think.
Yeah.
I think that might be right. I don't know. I should probably go through that portion of the technical manual compared to the stuff I've been learning. When I read the technical manual, I'm always looking at the weapon systems and the shields. So I almost never looked at the real detailed nitty gritty stuff. But
chapter 3. It's chapter 3.
All right, I'll take a look at it in a couple weeks and see. So all right. Well, it was a pleasure. We'll talk to you all.
Actually, hold on a second. Let me get rid of this. Let me do that, and we can say goodbye to everybody. So see you later, everybody.